I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about perfectionism and ADHD. What's the connection? So this is a remake of two videos I made in early 2021, and I'm redoing them because guess what? They weren't perfect. And guess again, this one isn't going to be perfect either. The sound is so bad that lots of people had trouble hearing the first one, so that's why I'm redoing them. But even though this one won't be perfect either, people are still going to be able to learn from it, hopefully. So that will be accomplishing its goal. So my take-home message for perfectionism and ADHD is that while perfectionism and ADHD may seem at some level like opposites, perfectionism is actually commonly associated with ADHD. And while in some instances, some aspects of perfectionism can be considered an asset, on the whole, most research indicates that perfectionism is problematic and leads to distress and dysfunction. And there are some research suggesting that the most common cognitive distortion in ADHD is perfectionism. It's the number one barrier to productivity. We'll get into that. And one of the most commonly self-identified problems among people with ADHD. The good news is there are a wealth of studies and approaches that can measurably reduce perfectionism. And since we're not going to be perfectionistic, our goal doesn't have to be to eliminate it completely. What is perfectionism? So the definition used by researchers, psychologists, psychiatrists, is perfectionism is straining compulsively towards unattainable goals, or striving to be in a flawless state devoid of any errors or any mistakes. Connected with perfectionism is a tendency to measure one's self-worth by their productivity and accomplishments, that their inner sense of well-being or worthwhileness is really strongly tied to what they are doing. There's a strong connection to being harshly self-critical and perfectionism. And within the research on perfectionism, some people break it up into two big categories. One is self-oriented perfectionism versus socially prescribed perfectionism. So self-oriented perfectionism is when you are not meeting your own standards, your own internal standards. So the motivation for this is internally. There is some correlation with striving harder, working harder, being more diligent. That could be a positive aspect, as opposed to socially prescribed perfectionism, which is fairly universally considered a maladaptive trait. So that is tying what you're doing to the expectation of others. You're trying to please others. Your motivation is external to yourself. It's, again, strongly correlated with insecurity and negative self-views. Although there may be healthy aspects to self-oriented perfectionism, much of the study actually suggests these two aspects of perfectionism tend to be fairly closely correlated. They're not in everybody or in every situation, so you can be sort of purely internally perfectionistic or socially prescribed, but there's a lot of overlap. Most people with perfectionism tend to have both aspects motivating them. Some of the studies suggest it's slightly higher in women than men, but that's a few percentage points. That's not a huge difference. But interestingly, at least one study found that self-oriented perfectionism, the internally motivated, was actually less heritable, heritability around 25%, compared to socially prescribed perfectionism, where the genetic component, the heritability, was closer to 40%. To put that in perspective, again, ADHD, the heritability is about 80%. So both of these are less genetically wired into people than as ADHD, but it's interesting that it would be the socially prescribed that people would be more genetically predisposed to. Either type of perfectionism, when people fail at perfectionistic goals, and by definition, you will fail because they're not attainable, there's high correlations with depression and anxiety being caused, suicidality. Both intentions and actions are strongly correlated with perfectionism. And there's some neuroscience research that people who are prone or primed for perfectionism process the world, particularly the visual world, in a finer grained way. So they are seeing the little details rather than the bigger picture. We might also attribute this to a left brain versus a right brain, so a detail-focused versus the whole holistic picture. One of the strongest associations is with eating disorders, particularly anorexia. but also narcissistic personality disorder. There's a strong overlap with perfectionism. I have to be perfect. I have to see myself as perfect because I really feel so badly about myself and that I'm so inferior. I have to cling to this image of perfectionism. There's some correlation with OCD, the obsessive compulsive disorder, checking, counting, tapping, doing things like that, but more strongly with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is almost by definition a perfectionistic style where someone does things. Again, they may not be counting, tapping, repeating in an obsessive way, but they're striving for perfection. So on the surface, ADHD seems antithetical to perfectionism. Isn't ADHD characterized by impulsivity, not by obsessionality and compulsivity? And aren't some of the classic symptoms of ADHD making mistakes through careless inattention and blurting out comments and procrastinating and turning things in late and forgetting tasks and getting off track? So isn't that just the opposite of perfectionism? Oh, again, what we know is at least 30% of individuals with ADHD have significant symptoms on the OCD spectrum. That sort of gives an insight as to some of this is related, or some of the connection between perfectionism and ADD is maybe less control over directing thoughts. Weaker executive functions could actually be leading to greater perfectionism and ADHD, even though, again, there's some genetic component. That means there's some non-genetic component. For everything with human behavior, there's both nature and nurture going on. Some have more of one than the other, but almost everything humans do behaviorally has both contributing. There are genes for perfectionism, there are genes for ADHD, and with almost everything in mental health polygenetic. So there are a multitude, hundreds, if not a few thousands of different genes, each contributing a tiny bit, depending on which variant of the gene you have. And some of those genes are predisposing both to perfectionism and ADHD. So there's some genetic overlap in the contribution. But more of the emphasis has looked at the nurture aspect, what aspects of the environment, the psychology, the interpersonal factors are contributing. And in the psychological and psychodynamic literature, there's a lot of research and a lot of theorizing and speculation that growing up with adults who are critical, that's most often parents, but it can be siblings, it can be teachers, it can be other important individuals. And living with hypercritical individuals can create a sense that the child is not good enough. Children, even bright and intelligent ones, even if they can intellectually understand their parents or people around them are flawed, blame themselves and see themselves as a center of things. So if they're being criticized, that's going to reinforce, I'm not good enough. If I were better, I'd be loved more. If I wouldn't be criticized, it wouldn't be picking on me. The world wouldn't be falling apart. That could lead to sort of obsessively focusing on trying to get everything right, trying to be the good little boy or girl, and doing everything to perfectly please others. Or again, it could be internalized to live up to your own standards that I have to be good enough because nothing else in this world is good enough. They're all flawed and defective and I can't rely or trust on them. Certain clear logic to, if you feel rejected, that makes sense. It's logical you should try to work harder, but in terms of perfectionism, if we carry it to an extreme, this is ineffective because you can't be perfect. And obsessive striving actually pulls you away from people, pulls you away from social interactions. It's associated with greater loneliness and greater social rejection, which again, on the psychological terms, is sort of what you're trying to avoid. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you focus on being perfect, the more likely you are to be rejected. Somewhat related to this is a different psychological approach, and that is, objectively, people with ADHD do make more social mistakes. They do make more simple errors in their work. They create more social faux pas by stepping on people's toes, figuratively and literally, blurting things out when it's not appropriate, missing cues as to what's going on and saying or doing the wrong thing. And in some people, it's theorized that perfectionism and OCD traits are an overcompensation, that people are trying to correct. I know I've made mistakes before. I'm going to go over my homework 17 times to make sure I didn't make a mistake before I can turn it in. And then in the introduction, I referred to Russell Ramsey's. He's one of the leading CBT for ADHD experts at University of Pennsylvania, and studies with colleagues. He's found that the most common cognitive distortion among people with ADHD is, and that's causing dysfunction in their lives, is perfectionism, is feeling particularly that everything needs to be perfect before I can go ahead with this task. Two big areas where it tends to intrude. One is on starting tasks and the other is completing tasks. It can also interfere with the middle of the task. And with starting tasks, it's often the sense I need the perfect conditions before I can get started. People with ADHD tend to be distracted. So I'll put away my pens, I'll put away my paper, I'll close all the tabs, I'll clean up my desk. There's distractions there. I'll wipe off the desktop, I'll go, and someone winds up cleaning the garage and doing everything else instead of the task at hand. Or it can be perfectionism regarding the right mindset. Okay, I was going to start at 3:00. I was going to devote an hour to this task, and now it's 3:02. I'm late. I've screwed up this hour. I've ruined it. I don't have an hour anymore to do it, so I might as well not do it. I don't feel ready. I don't feel, some days I'm on, some hours I'm on. I'm just not going to do my best right now if I do it, so I might as well not. I'm not completely rested. There might be distractions. I might be worried about X, Y, or Z. So since I'm not in a perfect state to start, I might as well stop. Compounding all this is that once someone isn't living up to their perfectionistic plans or goals, I was going to do this and now I'm not doing it, that can trigger depression, anxiety, rumination. And depression, anxiety, and rumination are all activation of the default mode network, that internally focused ruminative, which is inactivating or at some level suppressing the task-oriented doing something network. So it's even pulling you further out of the ability to get started and do something. And then one final layer compounding this is the emotional dysregulation layer, that those with ADHD are more likely to have large feelings and less controlled feelings. So feeling that you're not doing what you're supposed to be and that you're a failure, disappointing yourself can lead to an emotional meltdown, and that further makes it even more difficult to get started. And there are aspects of what we do in ADHD treatment, coaching, helping, that can actually feed into this mindset. And that is embedded in the concept of neurodiversity is your brain is different. Your brain thrives under different conditions. You need optimal conditions if you're going to work. You really need to remove all the distractions. You need to do X, Y, or Z. You need certain accommodations or you can't perform at full force. Now, I think there are good and valid reasons, and I have a talk on accommodations. I call them efficiencies rather than accommodations. So there may be a grain of truth that your brain works differently, but the main message we should be delivering is that if you don't start, nothing gets done. And that once you get started, and most people with ADHD can acknowledge having felt this, even if they felt out of sorts, even if they felt their brain wasn't working that well this day, once they get into the task, are performing better than they felt they were going to initially. So yes, you may be more sensitive to the initial conditions or the overall ongoing conditions if you have ADHD, but that doesn't mean you can't perform at some level and even a good level once you get started. In terms of completing tasks, the perfectionist comes in when it feels like I can't turn it in yet, I can't stop, I'm not perfect enough, it's not good enough. I need to do one more thing. I need to revise it one more time. I need to double check. I need to tweak a little more. And this is compounded by other ADHD traits of distractibility. So when you're refixing it, you may be looking at something else and open up another file and do 42 other things. It's compounded by poor time management. So you might not have left enough time for checking it or revising it. And then particularly once the deadline is missed or delayed, then that can be compounded by feelings of guilt. It's already late. I'm already screwed up. It's already a failure. I shouldn't turn it in anyway. And most of the time, turning in something is going to be better than turning in nothing. Perfectionism can also interfere in ADHD in the middle of the task. Hyper-focusing states can be perfectionistic states, trying to track down everything, all the information. So how do we change perfectionism? If it's genetic, doesn't that mean I can't change it? Isn't it part of my personality? And we know that personalities don't change. So what we say to that is that genes at most predispose a person to a range. So if this is the range of perfectionism and perfectionism itself, some people are perfect perfectionists, some are only moderately good perfectionists, some people aren't perfectionistic at all. But perfectionism genes at most predispose you to a range somewhere in that perfectionism spectrum. And within that range, you can slide within your range. So if you're predisposed to even be at the strong perfectionistic end, if you slide back towards middle in that range, you're doing better. And you can probably even learn to expand whatever your genetically suggested indicated ranges with practice. So we actually have lots of evidence that many different psychotherapies can change perfectionism. Most of the work that I'm familiar with is on cognitive behavioral therapy. Medications have not been studied extensively, but don't seem to have as powerful an impact. So with cognitive behavioral therapy, it's becoming aware of the errors, the distortions, the wrong thinking that you're having underlying perfectionism and changing your thinking. And the changing your thinking results in changing behaviors and changing feelings. With interpersonal therapy, that can reduce perfectionism, and that's tied into that some of the origins of this are imagine you're going to be rejected if you're not perfect, and learning, hey, you're okay as you are. You don't have to be perfect to be accepted. A subset, and it's tied into both of the other two, is exposure response therapy. Go ahead and try it. Turn in the homework even if you haven't reviewed it 17 times. So see what actually happens if you get a B instead of an A, if you've been getting A's all semesters. That's not a failure. That's not a rejection. You will live through. And the fourth sort of general psychotherapy that's effective in dealing with perfectionism is acceptance commitments therapy. So it's sort of accepting what you can't change and making commitments to change your behaviors to adjust the things you can. And I'm going to throw in more than a dozen sort of ADHD tips that are drawing on all sorts of these in a not particularly organized fashion. So cognitively, number one, learn to set realistic goals. People with ADHD tend to jump into a task without knowing the whole terrain. So they may have unrealistic ideas of what the task is. They may have unrealistic ideas of their own abilities and their resources, and particularly in terms of the time they have available for the task. People with ADHD over-volunteer. They do things that are interesting to them rather than things that are important to them. So part of setting realistic goals is, one, learning to say no. You may really want to be on that committee. You may really want to help starving children in the third world. But if you don't have the time and resources, it's best to say no. And related to that, and that's one of my other points, is learning to retract your involvement once you've realized you're overcommitted. Other aspects of learning realistic goals is learning to assess your own capabilities. You're not comparing yourself to a professional ball player or someone who's been managing these types of accounts for 42 years. You should be assessing your own abilities. Or if you're playing music, you're not a professional orchestra concert musician. You're not a best-selling author at this point. So using valid and realistic goals for your assessment and what the task will attain. So number two is the calendar is your friend. I have a whole video on this, so I won't go into a real depth, but it's useful for seeing how committed you already are. What hours do you have left for this task? What hours do you have today to complete this task? The calendar makes you pause and reflect, jumping into it hopefully, or reassessing after you have volunteered or taken on a task. Life creates time constraints. And the most blatant or clear one is mortality itself. Now, maybe the Silicon Valley gods will be changing that in the near future and we'll all live forever. And then maybe perfectionism will be a viable mode of life. But right now, we have finite lives. If you don't complete the task, it's zero. It registers as nothing. So 3, it's okay to consult with others about what's reasonable scope of a project or a timeline. So particularly if you have trouble sorting out, is this realistic or am I being perfectionistic? You can ask your coworkers, you can ask your manager or boss, you can ask your spouse. Number 4, and I touched on this earlier, you're allowed to revise your commitments. That's a very useful skill for people to learn. You can actually use your ADHD as an explanation, not an excuse. You can tell people, and I'd say it's stronger if you tell people in advance about this rather than afterwards, but you can use it afterwards. If you tell them in advance, I have ADHD. Sometimes I jump into things that I don't really have time for, don't really have bandwidth for, don't really have experience with, promise more than I can deliver. Usually the earlier you correct that, the better off people are. They can find someone else to do the task or decide that task won't be done at all for this project. Waiting to the last minute or beyond the last minute is less productive. Number 6, almost every task performance is actually on a spectrum. This is sort of why perfectionism is the very end point of the best of the best. Perfectionist sees anything short of that point at the very end is a bad thing, is a disaster thing. That's just simply too rigid, too ridiculous. Now, that doesn't mean everything is relative and everything has leeway or given it. In America, you're supposed to drive on the right side of the road. It's not being perfectionistic to insist on that or expect that. You can't say, today I'll drive down the middle, or I'll drive down the left. I'm not saying all rules should be ignored, but again, most tasks exist on a spectrum of quality or thoroughness or detailedness, with, again, the perfection at the very end being an unattainable impossible. 7, learning to frame things as you might have perfectionistic tendencies or behaviors, but you are not a perfectionist. And why that's useful framing is because it's easier to change a behavior than an identity. If you say, well, this is who I am, I can't, then that implies I can't change it. And again, the genetics are not definitive. They are pushing you into a certain realm or range, not a certain point on the spectrum of perfectionism. Number 8, remembering perfectionism is only one part of you. So one part of your brain may be perfectionistic, but that's only a small part of your brain. The other parts are around and they can help counter this perfectionistic tendency. And the whole brain is almost always stronger if we learn how to elicit it or engage it than the perfectionistic single part of it. Number 9, and I often start with this one, particularly in sessions with people when they're talking about doing something in a perfectionistic way, and I say, well, that's too bad that you're probably not going to join the 7 perfect people on this planet. And when I say that, they usually say, 7 perfect people, who are the, there's no perfect. If you tell people nobody's perfect, it's so trite, it's so used, people don't listen to it. It's completely ignored. Or they say, well, he's saying that about them, but I can be perfect, or I'm not trying to be perfect, I'm just trying to do a really good job. So I often frame it that pretending there's 7 perfect people on the planet, which there aren't, again, it emphasizes perfectionism is not attainable. We are humans. We are fallible. We make mistakes. Everything out there is improvable in some way. And if you don't think it's improvable, you just haven't thought about it enough. Number 10 is find an imperfect role model. Find someone who isn't perfect copy. How hard is that? Or emulate? Easy, because everyone out there is imperfect. Every role model you seek or look at is imperfect. Learn to appreciate both their greatness, their skills, their capabilities, their accomplishments, and their flaws. Now, in the sports world, we have people these days who are paid tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. They practice thousands of dollars a year on their athletic abilities. But, even a good baseball pitcher is making balls more than he's making strikes. Even a perfect hitter is swinging and missing more than he's hitting. Even a perfect 3-point thrower is missing the majority of the time. Even the greatest of all time, the GOATs, are making mistakes. They're not perfect. And that's not just sports. That's the same in art. It's the same in politics. If you identify the person you think is the best president of all time, I guarantee you, if you think about it, you can identify something they did was wrong, or maybe many things they did was wrong. And if you can't, then you're actually delusional, because there have been no perfect presidents, even if you like their general policies or their style. Number 11, remembering perfect is the enemy of the good. Again, if you focus so much on perfection that you're not getting anything done, then you have nothing. Getting back to sort of the exposure therapy and trying it. One single mistake seldom derails a career or a romantic relationship or anything in life. Why is that? We pay attention to mistakes. Mistakes are bad. 1, your enemies already dislike you. Now, a mistake may reinforce that. That doesn't establish or cement their opinion. They already have that opinion. 2, your friends already hold you in positive, high regard. They'll probably cut you some slack. Their assessment is based on what they've known for you over time, and they know nobody's perfect. They may be surprised at some error or mistake. They're not going to fundamentally usually realize their opinion. And of all the people who didn't know you before you made the mistake, most of them will keep on not really knowing you. They'll keep ignoring you. You won't register as a big blip. So besides, in life, your task is to manage your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors, not those of others, because they're happening in someone else's head. You can't really manage them or change them. What you can work on is yourself. So a few more points in there, a little more behavioral maybe than cognitive. Although I'm going to start with mindfulness. The most helpful thing to countering perfectionism is being mindful of two things. What and when. What is your goal? What is it that you're actually attempting to do? Are you really attempting to complete the best English paper of all time? I mean, that's a meaningless, undefinable goal. Or are you trying to do an adequately explain why the Elizabethan gentry had this influence on Shakespeare's plays? So focusing on what you're actually trying to accomplish and when is, what is the time you have allotted to this? When is this due by someone else's standards? And this folds into, and I have a video on this, the quest, not test framework. So if you focus on your goals, your aims, your overarching, what you're trying to achieve, you're almost always better off than focusing on making things into a test. And perfectionism is the ultimate of making everything a test, and if I'm not perfect, I failed on it. And why this is a useful strategy is that it reminds you if you are blocked or failed on this particular path, there are almost always other options. Life will keep giving you additional chances. There is very seldom only one pathway to a destination, and this ties in particularly with ADHD. Your ADHD nonlinear thinking is an advantage to finding an alternative, unusual pathway to your goal. Second sort of behavioral approach is accountability to others. And again, you can let others decide if your performance is good enough. Your team members, your managers, your audience, you don't have to decide all that all the time. That doesn't mean you can't try harder. It doesn't mean you can't work longer. In the workplace, remembering what is your goal? Your goal isn't to do the best X, Y, or Z. It's to do something that fits in with your team or your company's goals. They hired you for a task, not to be the best at anything, not to be perfect, but to get something done. And if you don't get it done, if you're not meshing your accomplishments with others, results in failures or temporary blocks or failures. Part of that is remembering, even if they don't always express it well, they don't see it that way, your boss, your company, your coworkers are invested in your success. If you screw up, that makes everyone on the team screw up. I do have a separate video on this, so I'll jump through it really quickly. And that is SPWN, schedule, prepare, wants, no negative. Schedule a specific time. Block out the time you need to do this. Prepare ahead of time. So if there are other tasks you need to do before you can jump into it, take care of those ahead of time. If you need someone's phone number, if you need certain paper equipment, need it there. If you need certain clothes to get to wear to the gym workout, get your clothes ready ahead of time so you're not wasting your gym hour looking for your gym clothes. And then when it's time on your calendar, get in touch with why you want to do it, not with why you need to, have to, should. Those aren't very motivating. And then also do not engage with negative backtalk. If it's on the calendar, who put it on the calendar? That smartest, wisest, kindest person of you, who's part of you, who's trying to align what you're doing in the moment with your lifetime goals. Afterwards, you can evaluate. Maybe that's a bad place to put it on the calendar. Maybe you shouldn't do it this many times a week. And then the last point I'm going to make with perfectionism and ADHD is that perfectionism is actually a form of anxiety. Anxiety can almost always be framed as an attention problem. And by that, I mean, when you are perfectionistic, you are directing at least some of your attention, some of your focus, or some of your energy to evaluating the outcome, to evaluating how well you're doing, or evaluating what you think other people will think of this project, rather than directing it at the process of doing. So that evaluating, that critical mindset is eliciting, is strengthening, is engaging the default mode network. It's taking you out of the task-related network. So again, getting out of the perfectionism towards what am I expecting myself to be doing now, rather than how well am I doing it. So I hope this is helpful. That's all I have to say for today. Stay healthy, stay happy,